learn from people who have been there and done that. I want to learn from people who have faced incredibly challenging situations and learn and develop resilience from that and come up with practical solutions and have had to put them into action. And I don't want to learn martial arts from some guy who's never done it but has written a book on it. I want to learn from a guy who's an ex-champion. So that's why I want to get a lot of your opinions on the resilience that we're going to have to develop to get through our current challenges. And so I'm going to take you through some of the things that I've learned from some of the books I've been reading. And the first book I'm going to reference is one of you that you and I both know is a book called Resilience, written by Eric Greitens, who's an ex-Navy SEAL. And he was saying in that book that resilience is defined as moving through hardship to become better, and that it was a teaching philosophy which started in Greece. And they said that it was a philosophy that helped us deal with problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically. And I think that's what I want to talk to you about today. What are some of the things? Let's talk about, first of all, in our current challenge, which is everybody's in social isolation, living at home, and they're worried about what's going to happen. And then they're going to have the problems of perhaps their jobs not being present when they go back. What are some of the things that people can do to develop some resilience from a practical perspective while they're sitting at home?
It's timely, mate, because I just wrote a post on the Warriors Path Academy Facebook page last night that really speaks to this particular question quite well. And I wrote a bit of a blurb built onto it. It's something that Carl von Clausewitz wrote many, many years ago in the context of war. And what it was about was the severe training side of things. So it's either direct experience of hardship. He used the term war, and I've just bracketed in hardship, so it's more generic in our modern context. But it's the hardship that forges us to develop the resilience, or it is severe training. And I use the word severe at the moment because a lot of the training that is out there is not tough enough. It is just simply too soft, too ease-centric, and we're actually ripping our students off in that space because they're not actually forged by any kind of challenge. We don't do that anymore. And as a consequence, we've had a long period in our society of comfort, ease, and convenience. Those things, like any sort of animal you put into that situation where it doesn't have to worry about predation, shelter, water, food, it's kind of safe. It switches its mindset to other things. And in our case, it's been to addictions, it's been to increasing our sense of pleasure and luxury. And we've pursued things away from that Spartan lifestyle. And I'm not saying that we should all be like just sleeping on the floor and bare concrete and like just being completely like over the top with it. But we've gone over the top with it in terms of the pursuit of comfort and creature pleasures by and large. From my observations, probably from my worldview, it's stark, because when I stepped out of the military, where I'd been in basically a cloistered bubble of that Spartan kind of culture for most of my adult life, I stepped out as a civilian and went like, my gosh, what have you guys been doing out here? Because everyone was portly and overweight, and people were focused on things that were really not quite important as far as I could ascertain at that stage. And I had very little interest in developing sort of resilience. That was like back then in the early 2000s, the term hadn't even really been coined in common usage as the way it has now. It was still like, what? It's kind of like, it showed up for me first in crisis management, crisis and emergency management. I was working for a period of time in that space, and a guy put out an international standard, an ISOS, talking about organizational resilience. And the company I was with at the time said, look, this is your space. Can you sit down with the author of this guy and have a look at what he's done? I went, yeah, cool. And it's the first sort of thing I had where there's an awareness of this term resilience in that usage that we now sort of take for granted. And now we're finding ourselves, having been soft and cuddly for a while, having to now really radically deal with dynamic change. And if you look at my definition of the way survival is really risk management combined with being able to cope with fear and stress and dynamic change. We've kind of got all those wrapped together in the current environment. If you're sitting at home in fairly and relative safety, there's a lot of stress underlying us. So the approach I'd offer, Greg, is this. You know, I've used the stopper one in the past, the sit, think, observe, plan, and act as a simple mnemonic to get people in emergency situations to regain some emotional control. Because what we find in that dynamic space is people get their brain running the show in a negative thought pattern. It's not beneficial. And it triggers that neurological software patterning of adrenal release. We've got our fight and flight system then kicked in, our limbic brains in absolute full roar. And then we're unable then to process things at a more analytical level. We've switched off those attributes of our neurology. Now, if you look at that sympathetic line of sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, our rest, digest, repair, it's all switched off when we're under stress. And our science tells us that very clearly now. So when we're in that state of anxiety, be it sitting in our living room wondering about the future, or we're staring down the laneway at a raging buffalo heading towards us, our nervous system's responding in the same way. And I think the trick with resilience and with stress management is to accept that software is going to be in place. It's going to undertake its role, and you just need to be aware of it. So a lot of the training I've spent over the last 20 years has been becoming aware of that myself, and then also making sure that people I teach are aware that that is going on. So there's a red flag system that comes up. The sit, think, particularly, is the first implementation of that sort of process. If we don't have an awareness that something's going on, that chemistry is now affecting our physiology and our psychology, then we're completely slave to it. And most people, to be completely honest, when something goes bang, that's what's going on in their experience. They are completely slave to this early version of limbic response to threat, and it just plays out, and they can't make sound decisions. They can't bring to bear the full resource of their intellect. Yep. To sit back and go, what's actually going on? So first point is about getting that under grips. The second point is getting into an observer position. And those two kind of work hand in hand.
That's the orientate part.
Yes. So the sit and the think is about getting to grips with your underlying neurology as it plays out in physiology and the biochemistry that supports it. Bang, you've got a dump of adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol in your system. It's going to make you behave and experience through all your senses certain things. It's a filter of what's going to be necessary to get you out of trouble now. That's great when there's a tiger there, but it's not necessarily great when there's a more distant level of threat that creates increased anxiety. That's the space most people are in now. It's not they're in immediate peril, but there's that foreboding, that anxiety and nervousness built up because there's uncertainty. And human beings love certainty. We love familiarity. And when that's suddenly threatened and challenged, we respond with that same neurological pathway. We get the same impact on our ability to perform. So we've got to get that under wraps first. These days, the stopper mnemonic I used early on, probably about maybe 5-6 years ago now, within Bushlaw Survival School, I started introducing what was called combat breathing. I've since changed the terminology for my own reasons back into battle breathing, as in it's a battle to stay calm. And battle breathing's simple. We've been teaching it to astronauts and Olympic athletes and special forces guys for about 20 odd years now. And it's a simple process of cyclic breathing. And it's, you see it in the yogic traditions. You see it in a lot of our ancient spirituality sort of traditions, where it's just that control of breath, the focus of breath, the focusing upon breath. But at a physiological level, it's also a mechanism that allows us to soothe our limbic response to what we perceive. And it's simple. You know, it's an inhalation of about 4 seconds, a nice deep belly breath, inhalation for 4 seconds, hold for 4 to 5 seconds, and exhale for 4 seconds. I've recently modified it to exhale to about 6 to 8 seconds, so it mimics the sigh response of the human body, which we only do when we're safe. We only can breathe that way, in that cyclic deep fashion, when we're safe. You don't do it when you're running from a tiger. So we're basically giving them messages to our limbic system to say, it's all good, calm down. So that inhalation process and holding and exhalation also can give us some control over our heart rate. And you know, that's one of the things we need to get down, so we can start to get some control over our system, both our physiology and our psychology. We can't do that if we've got a heart rate of 145 beats per minute. So the science tells us about 115 beats per minute is the threshold. And we can stay below that or below, we get some level of fine motor coordination. We have some level of analytical and cognitive thought process still accessible to us. We can make more complex decisions other than that way fight, that way run. That's what we're limited to with a full-blown, you know, limbic system response. So it's a simple method, and it's so simple, it's almost like, really? How did we miss that? But we did. We missed it for generations, and we brought it back in. And now our special forces soldiers are taught combat breathing for that particular reason, because when we've got a soothed limbic system, we can perform with the advantages of our adrenal system response kicking in, but still do the other stuff that's going to make us be efficient on the battlefield. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is what I call, it's languaging. It's mind languaging. And I use a particular phrase, and that phrase is simply, isn't that interesting? So it doesn't matter what I'm dealing with, what's in front of me, to give myself an observer position. So to take the person, the direct attack. Oh, this is all against me. Why me? This is unfair. To remove all those nuances, you step back into a bigger frame. And I just use that simple phrase of, isn't that interesting? These people are having a go at me. Isn't that interesting? And what I'm automatically saying to do is I'm languaging my thoughts. It's giving them something useful to do, but it's also giving them something to step back from. Don't be so personal about this. You know, on training you've done here, you would have heard me talk about being professional, never personal in combat. It's never about, you know, you trying to prove something. That's an ego platform of interaction that is not useful. It's like two young 18-year-old blokes trying to prove who's the toughest guy in the playground type thing. So it's not useful. It's kind of pathetic to watch. So we've got to remove that ego space out of our thinking. And we do that by stepping back, not physically in a geographic relationship, but from a perspective. And then by and large, we end up with increased peripheral awareness of the bigger picture. And this is what we found, or what I observed people doing. You know, these are high-level operators in the Australian Special Forces and in the US and UK Special Forces. Guys that were exceptionally good in room combat situations naturally exhibited this behavior. Others took time to develop it, and we couldn't. I wish I had known now what I knew, knowing then what I knew now. We could have got them to a higher level faster. But it's very much a sink or swim process. But it was clear some of us could just do this naturally. So it's just an inherent human behavior that we were basically being screened for and filtered and said, that's good, keep that one. and the other guys were struggling to keep up because they were overwhelmed with the amount of data they had to process and try and make sense of, because they're too up close and personal. Those that could naturally just step back a bit and go like, what's going on? It's like in the emergency trauma space, Greg. If you're up to your elbows in blood and guts there, and you're taking that at a very personal level, you can't see the bigger picture. And it's a discipline to step back from that up close and personal into a wider perspective. But then you get depth. And when you get depth, you see all the various interplays and interactions. There are a vast range of options available to us as potential solutions. So whether you're stuck at home in your living room, if you can soothe your limbic system and then step back into this wider perspective of life, a bigger frame where you're not taking it so personal. Why is my job being told? Why are we doing this? Let that little voice of ego sit over there in the corner while you step back as a mature and enlightened and evolved human being and go, okay, well, change is the only constant we know that exists on this planet. Why am I taking it so personally? And then the phraseology is simple. Isn't that interesting? I've just been sacked from my job, as opposed to the normal reaction, which is our adrenal response: anger, fear, frustration, anxiety. It's simply, wow, isn't that interesting? And you'll see it if you practice it in your own mind, your own speaking. You'll see that you automatically kind of withdraw to a reserved position, and you start looking at things much more objectively, much more big frame, much less personally, less ego, more of the person we should be. And then we handle the stress and duress of things in a much more appropriate way.
So then you can go on to the next part, which is the plan and take action, coming from a mental aspect where your brain is much better at making decisions. You're out of the monkey mind, you're out of the tyrant king mind, you're in the flow state. Have you read the book Stealing Fire about the flow state?
I haven't yet, but I'll have to.
Oh, you would love it. Well, you would love it, because big parts in there about special forces, how they're learning from the special forces some of the practical aspects of achieving the flow state. You know, the breathing, and when they talk about, you know, some of the plant medicines you can use for flow state, but also some of the physical and mental strategies that special forces have used to develop the flow state, knowing that when they're working in teams, it's like it's not a team of individuals, it's a smooth machine which is working, that are incredibly focused in this flow state. It was a fantastic book. You'd really love it.